I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I am talking with Shane Valentino, the production designer for the Trial of the Chicago 7, which is on Netflix. Shane, the first question I want to ask is, when you were officially hired to work on this project, what aspect of the production design were you most excited to tackle?
Oh, I think it's there. I don't know if there's a clear hierarchy, but I think absolutely the courtroom in and of itself. I think it was a pragmatic issue also because financially we needed to build that set. And then I think I was off. I think there are several different riot scenes or protest scenes between the Vietnam protesters and the Chicago police, and so I was always interested in that design as well. That was one of the questions that Aaron had asked me when I interviewed for the project about how I would approach it. And fortunately, I had some experience on Straight Outta Compton, like dealing with the LA riots in the 90s. And so I was capable of really sort of helping him visualize the ways in which we can achieve something with conflict and aggression but does not necessarily need to show that much of the world. And so I think he was intrigued by that. So those are, I think, they're the two spaces that I was interested in when I started the project.
So, of course, this film takes place in the very late 1960s, which had such a distinctive style to everything, everything that was around at that time. And
Yeah.
I'm curious as to what are some of the design aspects of the late 60s that you find yourself to personally be a fan of?
Oh, I think it's graphics. I think first and foremost graphics. I think it's easy to get carried away by a lot of the sort of patterns and colors that were being expressed during that time period. But for me, I think there was a tremendous amount of interesting graphic design, and I always thought that this was a good way of actually translating the period. Was how the different groups had developed flyers and posters, ways of communicating through that kind of medium. Which is no different than from today. Like, I mean, we do it mostly through image, like in the translation of digital image, but it was nice to sort of see it in the way in which it was expressed back then. So I was excited about that prospect.
Were there any aspects of the design from the related to that period, the late 60s, that was particularly difficult for you to bring to life?
Oh man, I don't think so. I honestly, I don't. I don't think that. I think the challenges are only with the limits of filmmaking. I think and I say that in terms of the practical aspects, which are like how much time we're given to do the film, and then also the limitations of the budget. I think there is so much visual reference and material out there for us to really sort of dig through and curate to find the sort of look for something of this nature, that I find that to be less of an issue. I don't find that to be problematic. I think it's more about the limitations of how film is set up. I think that's what the issue is, especially when you're doing period. But I don't think anything specific about the spaces themselves was a problem in my mind.
You mentioned doing outdoor design for this movie and also for Straight Outta Compton when you worked for the scenes with the LA riots. And something I've always been curious about is, how do you go about doing production design for something that is outdoors? Because it feels like stuff that's outdoors, you're working with, scenery that is already there. Yeah. And I'm just curious, how do you go about achieving that?
Oh, it's different for each project. I mean, I think that I think what you're really asking is like, what is the design process? Because I think it's all integrated. And I think, what is asked when you're reading a project is like, how do you visualize this scene? And then I think what happens is like you distill it down based with a writer, director, or just the director about like, what are the best ways to achieve it, or like what are the themes that we're trying to articulate in these spaces. And then I think once you can distill it down, then you can decide what is the most important. And I think sometimes with filmmaking, we have to deal with our limitations, and I think especially with those scenes in Straight Outta Compton, and also the riot scenes in Trial of Chicago 7, it's how can we contain it? And it's really about like, how do we contain these spaces and still make it feel open and wide and dynamic, meaning that you can shoot in a 360 way even if you couldn't, and I think that that's mainly how we approach those kinds of spaces. And I think then, when you're able to then dive into that, then I think when we have a director of photography involved, then we're able to walk the space physically and then see how we can actually, how the camera is going to exist in that space. And then if it's appropriate or not. And then if all those things are coming together, then we know that this is the right place. And I think that's how that's how I've approached shooting in exterior spaces.
So was there any part of the design for this film that you were worried about during the shooting, but when you saw it in the finished product, you actually felt very proud of?
Oh, I think the one that I was very concerned about was the band shell, which was directly opposite the statue in Chicago that is really iconic, because it was one in which the protesters actually took the hill and actually occupied the statue and climbed on top of it and waved their flags. I was worried about that kind of dynamic between those two architectures, and I was also worried about the style and look of the band shell. But when I think we saw them together, and with the way in which we created the lived space for the protesters, like with the tents and et cetera all around, I think then when I saw it, I believed it, and it really worked.
So what do you think was the biggest lesson that you took away from working on this project?
Biggest lesson? I don't know. Like, I think one, I don't know if it's a lesson, but I think one of the things that I sort of, I think I really enjoy is transforming a space that is one thing in reality, but then can be turned into something completely different for our cinematic life. And I think what we did was the courtroom. The courtroom was a dilapidated church that we converted into an actual courtroom. And I think that was an absolutely fun prospect. And I take great joy in trying to see those, to really sort of, it really asks you to imagine those spaces, and then have the language and the ability to translate it to the people that are working with me to make it into something completely different. And I had a great team that helped me do that. So I think that was really something I will take away from this project.
That's so interesting that it was an old church that you shot those used for the courtroom scenes. I'm curious as to how do you what's the location scouting process like? How do you go about looking for these locations to, as you said, transform them into something completely different?
Well, I think sometimes it's by accident. I mean, I think the original prospect was to try and find a large enough space that we could build the courtroom set. And the original, in terms of the actual courtroom that the trial took place in, it's a Mies van der Rohe design in the international style federal courtroom in Chicago. And it is very antithetical to the style of courtroom that we created. And when we were looking for those spaces, it was just, there was basically a size that we were looking for to fit this sort of idea of, I did these basic renderings and models of what I think the size that we needed for the the blocking of the different scenes and the number of actors and actresses that we had in those scenes. And our location manager was out looking, and he found this space in Paterson, New Jersey, and it just kind of lined up. And it lined up because I think, you know, Aaron was really sort of interested in having that space really sort of speak to that traditional architecture. So we have these kind of like decorative trims around the windows, and we have recessed wood paneling, and we have these columns, and we have these decorative details that are of a different era, and it's not the same as that international style, which is more sort of like clean and rectilinear. I think that he wanted to sort of evoke what these 8 men were up against. Like, as you described it, it's like early on, it's like they were up against something that was much larger than them, you know, and that has been working against this notion of countercultural for a very long time. And so I think when all those things kind of lined up to kind of find that place, you know, you could say it's serendipitous, but I think it was just like we found elements in that space that we could work with, and then we just kind of ran with it. And I think that's what, you know, we were able to create.
So one other thing I wanted to ask about is, since we are an award site, you had an interesting experience. You were nominated for a BAFTA award, for Nocturnal Animals, and I'm curious, what was it like finding out? What was it like getting that nomination, and what was the experience like of being at the BAFTAs?
Oh, it was remarkable. I mean, I unexpected. You know, I think that, you know, Nocturnal Animals was one of my favorite experiences altogether. I mean, Tom Ford is such an aesthete that, you know, if you have I mean, I've been studying film since I was 14 years old. And so to work with someone who has an incredible knowledge of culture, and that means also film history and films themselves and the genres within films, it was just really fun to sort of work within that vocabulary with someone, and who has a really high standard and with design. And so I always felt that film was more of was more in that art house realm of filmmaking. So for BAFTA the BAFTAs to identify it as something that was unique, especially for a contemporary film for design, was also very unique. So I was very surprised by it. And you know, I think us going as a group to London for the awards was just an honor. You know, it was just an honor to be there. And it's very uncommon for a film to be nominated for production design, a contemporary film to be nominated for production design. So I looked at that as the crowning achievement, not winning the award, just more actually just going. Yeah, so it was just fun. The entire experience was fun, you know. So,
well, Shane, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you all the best this award season, and to all of our viewers, please like this video and smash that subscribe button, and don't forget to go to goldderby.com and use the Gold Derby app to make your predictions and see if you can outsmart the top prognosticators in Hollywood.